Hello everyone. We return now to the discussion of the phenomenon of videos about the Star Wars film The Last Jedi. We last touched on the idea of grifting and bad faith actors in fandom communities latching onto discourse about media properties. In that context, grifting, as such, is about making oneself malleable for the purpose of capturing the greatest number of clicks. I introduced that episode with a definition of bad faith, similar to how I've introduced this episode and all prior episodes. The basic appeal in that case is to a nuanced understanding of what it means to act in bad faith in discourse. Many people misconstrue bad faith to mean when someone is taking an uncharitable read of another person's statements or beliefs, when in fact this misconstrual lends a great deal of cover to real bad faith actors. Someone arguing in bad faith is not attached to the truth value of their own outward statements. A bad faith actor will alternatively say things they do not believe or opt to believe things they know they can't justify for the utility that these positions provide in their argument. The fact that bad faith describes a state where the speaker's genuine belief is liminally present and not present is a feature that has been the subject of some discussion among philosophers and thinkers, including figures like Jean-Paul Sartre, who said, quote, "How can one choose to reason falsely? It is because of a longing for impenetrability. The rational man groans as he gropes for truth. He knows that his reasoning is no more than tentative, that other considerations may supervene to cast doubt on it. He never sees very clearly where he is going. He is open. He may even appear to be hesitant. But there are people who are attracted by the durability of a stone. They wish to be massive and impenetrable. They wish not to change. Where indeed would change take them? We have here a basic fear of oneself and the truth. What frightens them is not the content of truth, of which they have no conception, but the form itself of truth, that thing of indefinite approximation. It is as if their own existence were in continual suspension. But they wish to exist all at once and right away. They do not want any acquired opinions, they want them to be innate. Since they are afraid of reasoning, they wish to lead the kind of life wherein reasoning and research play only a subordinate role, wherein one seeks only what he has already found, wherein one becomes only what he already was. This is nothing but passion. Only a strong emotional bias can give a lightning-like certainty. It alone can hold reason in leash. It alone can remain impervious to experience and last for a whole lifetime. The anti-Semite has chosen hate because hate is a faith. At the outset, he has chosen to devaluate words and reasons. How entirely at ease he feels as a result. How futile and frivolous discussions about the rights of the Jew appear to him. He has placed himself on other ground from the beginning. If out of courtesy he consents for a moment to defend his point of view, he lends himself but does not give himself. He tries simply to project his intuitive certainty onto the plane of discourse. I mentioned a while back some remarks from anti-Semites, all of them absurd. I hate Jews because they make servants insubordinate, because a Jewish furrier robbed me, etc. Never believe that anti-Semites are completely unaware of the absurdity of their replies. They know that their remarks are frivolous, open to challenge. But they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he believes in words. The anti-Semites have the right to play. They even like to play with discourse, for by giving ridiculous reasons, they discredit the seriousness of their interlocutors. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by a sound argument, but to intimidate and disconcert." End quote. Jean-Paul Sartre published these words in his hotly debated work, Anti-Semite and Jew, published in 1948, directly after a massive genocide which would pulverize the Jewish European population into scattered diaspora and traumatized survivors. The name of this event in the lives of its Jewish victims is the Shoah, loosely meaning catastrophe. The larger event beyond the scope of the roughly 6 million Jewish victims, and including another 6 million Gentiles, from queer people to disabled people, to those of other ethnic descent such as Romani or Poles, as well as political prisoners and those with criminalized behaviors, and also many Soviet prisoners of war, is all wrapped up into the word Holocaust, whose meaning indicates a burnt offering, a haunting allusion to victims whose bodies were burned in concentration camps. Sartre's attention, like that of so many others, was inspired to search for answers about how this could have happened, but where much reputable scholarship has been done of the history of World War II and the Holocaust, from military history to documentations of the numbers and names of the victims, other scholarship focusing on the ideals of Nazism in terms of the psychology of those anti-Semitic fascists can sail into hotly contested waters. I do not wish to present Sartre's work as totally uncontroversial, but rather as profound. He spoke, I think, to the manner in which anti-Semites thought, and where we can understand what motivates a person to think, we will invariably approach consideration of their actions. The schema of anti-Semitism, its associated thought patterns and logics, is instructive for many political analyses, but here we should consider how Sartre's descriptions of human patterns of behavior can be instructive to understanding other problems as well. The capacity to define wokeness in the context of any given media property can be illuminated by this analysis. There's actually an established media reference that should teach everyone in a word how wokespotting and bad faith argumentation operate. In Bill Watterson's much accredited classic newspaper comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes, there's a running gag of Calvin having invented his own sport, Calvinball. Whether Calvin plays with his stuffed tiger Hobbes, his neighbor Susie, or either of his parents is irrelevant, because the constant of Calvinball is that Calvin makes the rules and he makes them as he pleases, when he pleases. Calvin's right to play, to borrow a phrase from Sartre, is indicative of his supreme authority in the game. He is not like the other players. He is different. He is Calvin. As a segregated discursive authority, Calvin has the ability to dictate the rules in such a way that, for example, standing in one spot means you're out of bounds when another player does it, but when Calvin does it, the opposite is true, because the function of the rule is not to treat the players universally as equals, but rather the opposite. In a sense, Calvinball does have rules, which chiefly revolve around the fact that Calvin makes the rules and the rules serve Calvin. In this light, if Hobbes does what Calvin does, he really is out, and when Calvin does the same thing, he really is not out. Observing that this is the truth of Calvinball requires that we observe the kind of game the participants are playing. Egalitarianism is not strictly a liberatory idea. Specifically, many people can be equally in a bad situation, which would still be undesirable. But it is, in some measure, a prerequisite of liberatory ideas. You may have noticed I described Calvinball's resemblance to Holocaust denialism, a sentence I assure you I never thought I could write in plain English, and also that these phenomena in discussions bear a striking resemblance to the phenomenon of wokespotting, a phrase I've borrowed here from the popular YouTube channel Pillar of Garbage, who has a series of videos discussing that behavior. But this is not an essay about Pillar of Garbage. No, instead the YouTuber whose content will be instructive for us today is called Mr. Reagan. I realize this may all seem a bit on the nose, but his video, Star Wars The Last Jedi Every SJW Moment, is an excellent opportunity to tie together a few observations about videos in this genre. Compared to more recently trending lingo, SJW or Social Justice Warrior may seem a little archaic, but perhaps you'll see why it caught my attention if we dive into just some of its contents.
The movie opens with a tall man who looks to be in his 30s updating his commanding officer, a woman, about the situation. She aggressively barks orders at him as if he's an incompetent fool. This woman looks about 17 years old. So I don't know if this is an attempt to further emasculate the guy or if it was just bad casting. Why is a 17-year-old girl ordering around a 30-year-old man? I guess that's progressive SJW logic.
I'd like to offer some brief token rebuttals to these points before returning to the larger issue at hand. The female officer with whom Mr. Reagan takes such immediate umbrage is Lieutenant Connix, played by Billie Lourd. Her character was already established in The Force Awakens. If she strikes the role of the young, confident female officer who doesn't take lip from anyone, and honestly I think this is an overly sensitive read of her character, that would be owed to the proud Star Wars tradition of confident young women commanding entire full rooms of men, as seen in multiple scenes in the original trilogy with Princess Leia, played by Carrie Fisher, and also in the prequels with Padme Amidala, played by Natalie Portman. This character naturally takes after Carrie Fisher specifically, because, Billie Lourd is Carrie Fisher's actual daughter in real life. Okay, so Mr. Reagan's status as a fandom tourist is some pretty low-hanging fruit here. At around 3 minutes and 54 seconds into his video, he also claims that the ship Hux is on at the start of the film is called the Supremacy, when in fact the Supremacy is Snoke's ship seen later in the film. His misapprehension of or ignorance to big elements of the Star Wars films doesn't make him right or wrong, but it does shed some light on what's going on here. How does Mr. Reagan know for certain, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this scene is meant to emasculate men? He at first states it as if it were something whose prospect confused him, something he knows he cannot confirm, but then he seems to settle on describing it as a matter of fact. In a few deft rhetorical movements, our conservative talking head has levied a series of overproduced takedowns of the film based largely on what he can imagine within his own mind palace, and this naturally sets the tone of the video. By the way, Billie Lourd, who was in reality 25 years old when The Last Jedi first released, and who barks orders, as Mr. Reagan puts it, because the resistance installation on which she and her fellow rebels are standing is about to be bombarded into smoldering ruin, will be 32 in slightly over 2 weeks' time at this essay's planned initial release online. Happy early birthday, Billy. I hope it's a good one.
Anyway, it appears that they had a plan to take out this big nasty ship called a Dreadnought. Now, Leia wants to call off the mission after all the people on the planet below have escaped, but Poe still wants to take out the Dreadnought because he's toxically masculine. So they go through with their plan and they take out the Dreadnought, but a lot of their people die during this mission, and this causes a lot of conflict between Poe and his female commanders throughout the rest of the film. The female mind is strategic and intellectual, maternal and nurturing, and so Leia prioritizes the safety of the people under her command. The senselessly violent, toxically masculine mind wants merely to shed blood. Poe wants a murderous military victory and the glory that goes along with it, no matter how many of his fellow soldiers are killed securing it. The recurring message seems to be, women know best. You should never question a woman, and women make the best leaders.
The whole video is like this, by the way. Mr. Reagan walks the audience through the plot beats of The Last Jedi and denounces every imagined agenda he can project onto the film. It's easy to win an argument with an opponent whose body consists entirely of straw. By propping up a narrative in this way, Mr. Reagan, the Nightmare Imagineer, invents a whole new world for his viewers to stare at in wonder. Most of what he describes is not in the film. The basic plot beats are there, but the random justifications based on maternity and masculinity are totally absent from The Last Jedi as a text when it comes to the actual dialogue in the film. Mr. Reagan is constructing a creative reading of the film using some vaguely feminist-adjacent language, not for the purpose of adopting a feminist perspective, but to say, see this right here? This is actually another thing happening in disguise, and the bad people, the ones you don't like, they're doing this on purpose. Of course, to legitimate this style of analysis, he opens the video by showing tweets from some people who worked on the film describing the First Order as an analog for white supremacy. Mr. Reagan's audience might not immediately grasp this sleight of hand, but two things become clear here to the keen observer. First, a statement on the existence of an analog for white supremacy does not validate every insinuation of this film as having some kind of straw left-wing agenda. There are likely many real or theoretical kinds of oppression that could occur in human history that aren't contained within that single idea. A denunciation of white supremacy is probably implicit within the characterization of the First Order, going back to the use of cinematic language in The Force Awakens, paralleling General Hux's speech with Nazi propaganda. The colors, the visuals, the angry diction, and salute of stormtroopers is heavy-handed enough already. What these tweets say is straightforwardly true, but Mr. Reagan doesn't like it. He has a ton of things that he wants to accuse the creators of the film of believing, but he doesn't have evidence for those, just his own reading of the film. If his descriptions of those scenes were accurate, and I find that he tends to stretch the truth or ignore context, the meaning of those scenes could be incidental, but Mr. Reagan not only wants you to believe in dreams, he wants you to be suspicious of a conspiracy to put those thoughts in your head. The end result is a video that suggests that feelings the viewer may have are not the viewer's responsibility, but rather the true reality of a sinister, tricky group of people trying to sneak those ideas into all of our minds. Mr. Reagan might as well be telling us that monster cans bear the mark of the beast.
Now, do you know what a MILF is? Yes.
Second, and this builds on the previous point, Mr. Reagan tends to describe the ostensible agenda of the film in terms of an attack on groups, not ideas. White supremacy and fascism are ideas. If somebody says white supremacy or whiteness but secretly means white people, that's a dishonest use of those terms, to be sure. But Mr. Reagan never substantiates this idea. He merely implies the conflation by proceeding to act as if disputes with white supremacy are attacks on white people, or as if disputes with toxic masculinity were attacks on white men. These claims are, on their face and without evidence to back them up, fundamentally absurd and dishonest on his part. Racism and sexism are wrong and bad. If ideas that relate to these are implicitly critiqued in the film, what becomes conspicuous is Mr. Reagan's response. He isn't calling the film boring for critiquing bigotry and oppression, a thing artists tend to do that should surprise no one and is even implicated in George Lucas's description of how he wrote the original trilogy. But rather, Mr. Reagan is treating these as attacks on demographic groups. This is telling.
Okay, so in this scene, Leia slaps Poe Dameron. This is such a traditionally feminine thing to do that I can't believe they included it in the film. But this is the first example of the conflict between Poe and his female commanders. The male is always wrong, the female is always right.
Get your head out of your cockpit.
Get your head out of your cockpit, she says. This is a typical feminist idea that men only think with their phalluses, that our genitalia direct all of our thoughts. And this, I suppose, is a way to dismiss men as intellectually inferior to women, but it doesn't make any sense here. He wasn't trying to get laid, he was trying to be an effective warrior.
Okay, I was going to leave things at the second clip because frankly this is an exercise in tolerating tedium, but I found this clip far too funny to leave out. Leia says, "Get your head out of your cockpit," because Poe is thinking like a fighter pilot, not a resistance leader. He's thinking about all the stuff he just got to blow up, not the lives that were lost. This gives Poe a real arc in the film that begins with this inciting conflict. Any resemblance to phallic objects by way of semantic mouthfeel is humorous, but not overly important, and it breaks down almost immediately. Why would Leia tell Poe not to think with his genitals here? He's not thinking about sex, he's thinking about violence. Mr. Reagan is assuming a lot to make this very shaky analogy work, and frankly, there's something borderline Freudian going on here. He's not just inventing a narrative to do his analysis, it's also pretty shoddy analysis. As just one possible objection, why is the idea that men think with their phalluses a feminist idea? Usually feminist theorists describe male maltreatment of women in a sexual context in terms of power relations, not as a problem of sexual desire in itself. Which feminists is Mr. Reagan referencing? I can think of some right-wing commentators who might say this, usually invoked in the context of saying men only want one thing and boys will be boys, but those aren't feminist ideas, they're frequently actually patriarchal ideas. Mr. Reagan so clearly has a childish idea of leftism that has zero accountability to the facts, as shown when he insinuates earlier in the video that feminists think nothing matters because everything's a construct. This is factually inaccurate on its face, such a bald-faced lie that it's hard to believe anyone would take it seriously. If nothing matters to feminists who think everything is a social construct, and we're being extremely generous with our wording here, why do these feminists always act like oppression, which they think is real, matters so much to them? Mr. Reagan is telling a fib. This is, self-evidently, not what feminists believe, and his behavior gives it all away. Because if feminists thought nothing mattered, then he would have no call to action in this video because they would be no threat after all. I mean, why conspiratorially code a message of social justice if social justice doesn't matter? These and other contradictions in Mr. Reagan's narrative can be explained away defensively by saying that feminism makes no sense, so his description of feminism makes no sense. Again, this ignores the facts. If feminists believe something that doesn't make sense, then there must be a way to explain why they believe something that doesn't make sense. And that explanation must then make sense in order for us to hold that it is true. Mr. Reagan, however, like so many others, is not invested even in the truth value of his own claims, he's just invested in making them. What's so fascinating about this video is its naked adherence to formula and its latecomer entry onto the scene of discourse about The Last Jedi, even as Mr. Reagan affects the tone of someone seeing the film for the first time and reacting to it live. This video came out in late 2019, almost 2 years after the film. We've already discussed how the fallout around this film came in waves, with a few rejections being followed by a swell of anti-fandom hatred and a lingering legacy of outrage farming. That an openly conservative channel would opt to cover The Last Jedi is, at this stage, not surprising. In fact, the reverse is true. It would be more shocking if a conservative whose paycheck in content creation is predicated on user interactions chose not to engage with a popular discourse that allowed them to make money while also making inroads into fandom communities. The Steve Bannon and Breitbart strategy for Gamergate was alive and well, and it still emerges at opportune times, even now when the pattern has been more well established. Mr. Reagan was engaged in the prospect of woke spotting by another name, but it bears discussing what woke even means as an adjective and why it has followed so sharply on the trend of pejoratives like SJW or critical race theory. When critics of a certain feather explain what they think these ideas mean, the definitions all sound eerily similar. It's usually something fake oppression, something Marxism, something forced diversity, with a few words mixed around for good measure. If you travel in the same circles of the YouTube algorithm as I do, you may be familiar with a series of videos from the YouTuber Big Joel on the topic, specifically from his side channel Little Joel, and from these I found a provocative quote that might guide our inquest.
Bethany S. Mandel had time to think about it, I guess, and she wrote, wokeness is a radical belief system suggesting that our institutions are built around discrimination and claiming that all disparity is a result of that discrimination. It seeks a radical redefinition of society in which equality of group is presented as the endpoint enforced by an angry mob. I like this definition because the enforced by an angry mob aspect of it is like codified as part of the belief system. Like being woke actually entails getting involved in some kind of a mob. I like that definition. Ben Shapiro largely agreed with Bethany, writing, wokeness claims 1. Western civilization and its institutions were and are discriminatory and serve the purposes of those in power, typically straight white men, and 2. That discrimination is both historic and ongoing, and all group disparities are explained by it. Discuss. So yeah, he mostly agrees with Bethany, even agreeing that wokeness entails that all group disparity is explained by oppression, which I don't think most people believe, but they agree on the major point, which is that they think that wokeness is just a replacement word for like identity politics, for discussions of oppression, and they're wrong. They're wrong about this. I'm going to tell you the definition of woke right now, the way that conservatives use it. Woke, it means liberal. It means being a liberal. It means having liberal politics, particularly about race and gay people. It means liberal. The reason why I know this is because the word woke is not merely applied to identity politics situations. The simple belief, for example, that trans women are women is constantly being called woke. So wokeness cannot describe exclusively some belief about oppression relationships. It literally just describes having the liberal beliefs that liberals have about gay people and black people.
Big Joel would go on, after uploading this video, to have a dust-up with the channel Sitch and Adam after they reacted to this video, and the three of them would go back and forth a bit. Sitch and Adam are notoriously poor analysts due to their rhetorical style of interjecting on videos so frequently that their fans rarely get entire points from the video uninterrupted, a tactic also present in many videos about The Last Jedi, including some we've observed in this series, and which I, in a previous entry, dubbed Setsuna sophistry. Of particular note is that Sitch and Adam were insistent that the statement trans women are women is in fact a statement about oppression. This is fascinating because, per Big Joel's clarification, the idea that trans women are women is technically a statement about how gender and transness work, and if trans women were not oppressed, the statement would still apply. However, the seeming miscommunication between Big Joel and these two men might actually be no miscommunication at all. Theoretically, descriptions of oppression being real should be unnecessary when describing wokeness. Lots of people believe that oppression is historical and ongoing, Surely Ben and Bethany would not argue that historically oppression has occurred, but it would be perhaps just as silly for them to insinuate that it isn't occurring when conservative commentators frequently talk about conservatism as if conservatives are under attack. This behavior also frequently translates into posturing as defending the demographics whose, at this point, theoretical privilege is under scrutiny, like men or white people. Clearly, conservatives believe oppression is real. This two-facedness about discussing oppression is fascinating and gives the game away. Conservative commentators like Ben and Bethany need to walk this extraordinarily awkward line, because the reason that they deny oppression is real is owed to what an admission that an oppression is occurring would imply. When admitting oppression exists allows them to defend the things they like, then they avow it. But when it threatens the things that they like, they deny it. This is also why Mr. Reagan phrases his description of feminist and other left-wing beliefs as if they are attacks on demographics. He's claiming oppression, or at least the threat of oppression. When attacks on right-wing ideas can be restated in bad faith as attacks on entire demographics, that makes critics of privilege look like they actually want to be privileged themselves. This fear-mongering makes use of the utility of words from black slang in inspiring white fears of retribution, or acronyms that sound scary to someone who hasn't encountered them in a more straightforward capacity. The thing that Sitch, Adam, Bethany, and Ben have all more or less cottoned onto and talked their way around is that even when they hear things like trans women are women or climate change is real, they interpret these things as invoking oppression, because similar to what Big Joel says, that is the context in which liberals and lefties presently entreat those subjects, and so the reactionary assessment of those points as woke is predicated on a further assessment of why the people saying those things are saying them to begin with. This way of thinking is baked into conservative rhetorical appeals like the silent majority. Conservatives enjoy the benefits of bad faith assertions that most people share their perspective but are simply too polite to say so. Of course, they frequently cannot prove this, and it belies frequently entertained fantasies of persecution in the court of public opinion, but they say it anyway regardless of whether they can justify believing it, because the ability to say it is the point of presenting it as their belief. Trans women are women is woke to conservatives, not because the words themselves imply oppression, but because they're insinuating that a belief in oppression is what motivates liberals and lefties to make the statement itself. This is copacetic with the approach of Mr. Reagan and many others in analyzing The Last Jedi, as in order to make their arguments, they require an unsubstantiated insinuation as to why their adversaries say what they say. It needs to be mostly unsubstantiated with only a token appeal to evidence, because the point is that same act of fantasizing. Ironically, many conservatives who do this would likely chafe at having their own motivations for their statements adversarially interrogated here. You may have noticed a trend with YouTube videos and any other kind of content or post about perceived wokeness, which is that there's an assumption on the part of the commentators or posters that they simply know it when they see it. What this means is that the power to dictate what is woke and what is not affords the observer the right to operate on Calvinball rules in the context of oppression. The catch is that Calvin is the character privileged by Calvinball, as funny as that sounds. It is, after all, named after him, and he is its central figure, where all rules and play serves his status as such. Therefore, the Calvinball rules of wokespotting will inevitably primarily serve the status of any privileged identity demographic. This also makes it difficult to indict any commentator who calls a film or series woke the second they see a member of a minority group on screen. Their audience is left to take their meaning in whatever way they want, and any accusation that the commentator is calling something woke, or whatever the watchword of the next several years will be, on the grounds of the mere presence of a marginalized actor or character, can easily be met with the counter that the object of the criticism is not the presence of that actor or character, but rather the motive for that presence. Because motives for casting or writing are multitudinous, intersecting, and vague, even when they come from an individual person, this lens of critique is ill-fit for corporate products. But because of the aforementioned unequal nature of Calvinball rules, The presence of marginalized people already receives disproportionate scrutiny anyway, and this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where agendas can be observed where necessary to make the larger point. What could be an interesting discussion of the incentives fueling certain decisions in such a corporate product is left entirely by the wayside due to its quality of utter incompatibility with conservative politics. If you've been paying attention, you'll have anticipated exactly why conservatism or reactionary thought is relevant here. But here's the core of the issue in even plainer language for the uninitiated. Due to how woke spotting works, an unequal playing field means marginalized groups are its target, and the person doing the woke spotting inherently doesn't need to justify themselves. It's Calvinball Rules. Things are woke when someone antagonistic to social justice needs them to be. They don't need to be a conservative in any specified way, because the thing they are doing is based on social reaction to social justice. For the purpose of the interaction, they are playing the role of a conservative. Of course, calling somebody with the moniker Mr. Reagan a conservative would be a soft sell even if he wasn't uploading videos about how he supports Donald Trump. It's a pretty straightforward case, but what should concern us far more is how frequently we hear these talking points, and how we can come to understand them. In the second edition of his book, The Reactionary Mind, Conservatism from Edmund Burke to Donald Trump, Corey Robin writes that, quote, "For that is what conservatism is, a meditation on and theoretical rendition of the felt experience of having power, seeing it threatened, and trying to win it back." In that same section, without necessarily being able to know in advance that these discourses would unfold as they have, Corey Robin also gives a concept of what we would call wokeness. Quote, "Every once in a while, however, the subordinates of this world contest their fates. They protest their conditions, write letters and petitions, join movements and make demands. Their goals may be minimal and discreet, better safety guards on factory machines, an end to marital rape, but in voicing them they raise the specter of a more fundamental change in power. They cease to be servants or supplicants and become agents, speaking and acting on their own behalf. More than the reforms themselves, it is this assertion of agency by the subject class, the appearance of an instant and independent voice of demand, that vexes their superiors." Had he the foresight to predict he would be quoted in this context, Robin might have done well to add, "that vexes their superiors and all ideological adherence to the worldview of one who is superior." I suppose it doesn't flow as well. Nevertheless, in this quote, we can see the truth of both Big Joel's positions as well as Sitchin Adams' position. We can see the logic of Bethany Mandel and Ben Shapiro. We can see the need for the impenetrable logic Sartre describes. We can even see what might be the beginnings of a call to action for a commentary like Mr. Reagan's video. In his video series, The Alt-Right Playbook, YouTuber Innuendo Studios describes in one particular entry the phenomenon of thought and argumentation that we have considered here, and for reference uses the Seinfeld joke, "The card says moops." I think the observations in Innuendo Studios' video are fundamentally accurate, but they miss a critical discursive element found in Calvinball. That the card says moops is not the purpose of George's game, it is just a tactic he adopts. This is how left-wingers see bad faith behavior from right-wingers. The truth implied in Innuendo Studios' analysis, however, is that the fact that the card says what George needs it to say is the rules of the game George is playing. Reactionaries are not George, a neutral observer taking advantage of a fact in the world around them in bad faith. Reactionaries are Calvin. Their game of objectivity, whether it be in the objective meaning and quality of art, or the objective nature of their morals, is a function of how they engage with the very concept of truth.